My wife arrived from her boss's house with kiss marks on her neck and smudged lipstick. The smell of men's perfume still permeated her clothes, as if it were a dirty signature of what she had just done. My eyes swept over every detail, her disheveled hair, her rapid breathing, the slight tremor in her hands as she tried to hide her guilt behind a rehearsed expression of tiredness. But I knew. I always knew. And now, with the truth staring me in the face, there was no more room for doubt. So, there, in the middle of the room, in front of our children, I announced the divorce and revealed the whole truth about who she was. The silence that followed was as heavy as the impact of my voice. Our children's astonished gaze burned my skin like fire. The older man blinked several times, trying to process what he had just heard. The youngest pursed his lips, his eyes shining with contained tears. But my wife? Oh, she didn't cry. She didn't beg. On the contrary, his first reaction was shock, followed by calculated indignation, as if I were the true villain of that story. As if she were the victim. As if I didn't have the right to react, to expose his betrayal, to end that farce I had lived in for years. "Are you crazy?" she said, her voice thick with nervousness. "Let's talk about this, for God's sake. Children don't need to hear these things." But it was too late. There was no more conversation. There were no more concessions. My eyes were fixed on her, and all I saw was a lie. Every "I love you" whispered over the years, every night I held her while we slept, every laugh shared in the kitchen, it had all been a farce. The smell of that man permeated her was living proof that our marriage had already been destroyed long before I spoke those words. The eldest stood up abruptly. "That is true." His voice was shaky, in disbelief, as if he expected her to deny it, that it was a big misunderstanding. But she didn't respond. His silence was the loudest confession I have ever heard. His face contorted in disgust and, without saying anything else, he left the house, slamming the door. The smallest remained in place, motionless, his eyes wide, as if he wanted to disappear within himself. And I stood there, watching the woman I loved most in my life transform into the person I despised most. She tried to get closer. "It wasn't like that. You are exaggerating. It was a mistake, a moment of weakness." "Are you going to throw everything away because of one mistake? An error? A moment of weakness?" No. That was a choice. She made a choice every time she lied, every time she kissed me with lips that minutes before had belonged to another man. All the time she looked into our children's eyes and pretended to be the perfect mother. And me? I was just the idiot who believed her. "You already threw everything away the moment you opened the door to another man," I replied, each word laden with contempt. "Now it's my turn to close that door." But if I thought the worst had already happened, I was wrong. Because cheating isn't just the act of sleeping with someone else. It is the silent destruction of respect, trust, love. And nothing could have prepared me for the final blow. Our children weren't just disappointed in their mother. They were destroyed. And, worse, they started to see me as the culprit. The eldest didn't come home that night. The youngest looked at me suspiciously, as if I had broken the family, not her. As if the exposure of the truth was worse than the lie. As if I had killed the illusion that, deep down, maybe they wanted to keep believing. Because that's what betrayal does. It doesn't just destroy a marriage. It destroys everything around it, like an uncontrolled fire. And then, the real pain began. Because when you love someone, when you build a family, you imagine that loyalty is unshakable. But, in the end, what is discovered is that the betrayal is not just the wife who gives herself to another man. It's also about children who don't know how to deal with the truth. Who prefer to cling to the comfort of illusion than face brutal reality. Who look at their father, the one who was always there, and instead of finding a hero, they only find a man who destroyed their fantasy. I kicked her out of the house. I wanted her to suffer. I wanted her to feel every drop of the poison she spilled on our family. But justice doesn't work the way we want it to. Because, in the end, the children didn't see a cheating wife and a betrayed father. They saw a mother who cried and a father who screamed. And the scales somehow tipped the wrong way. And that's how it all fell apart. It wasn't just the marriage I missed. It was much more. That was all. But the question that hasn't left my mind ever since is, if I hadn't said anything that night, if I had swallowed the pain and kept up the charade for a little longer, would the outcome have been different? Perhaps. Or maybe the betrayal was just the beginning of something much worse. And now, there remains one question that haunts me every night: was I the victim of her infidelity, or was I responsible for destroying my own family? The answer may never come. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not support and never romanticize betrayal. The stories you will hear are fictional, but they reflect a cruel truth: betrayal destroys lives, erodes trust and leaves irreparable scars. Each narrative is a reminder of the high price of disloyalty and the inevitable consequences for those who choose that path. Get ready, because the story that comes next is intense, impactful and full of twists. Listen carefully, and be ready to be shocked. Night fell slowly, painting the sky with orange tones that faded into a deep blue. On the porch of the house, Daniel absently swirled a glass of whiskey in his hands, watching the lights in neighboring houses come on one by one. The gentle aroma of dinner prepared by Laura floated around the living room, mixing with the low sound of the television playing some irrelevant news. He always enjoyed these peaceful nights, the sense of stability that home provided, the comforting presence of his wife preparing something in the kitchen, the occasional laughter of his children echoing through the hallways. Small details that, for him, formed the basis of what a solid marriage should be. Laura has always been an elegant woman, with impeccable posture and an attentive eye, capable of deciphering Daniel's emotions before he could even express them. When they met, she was the girl who seemed to have the world under control, independent and determined, someone who always knew what she wanted. He, on the other hand, was methodical, meticulous in his choices, someone who valued constancy. Together, they formed a couple admired by everyone, as if they were made for each other. But the truth was that, as the years went by, the routine and responsibilities began to take a toll. Marriage, once full of novelties and discoveries, became a sequence of predictable habits. The children came and brought joy, but also challenges. Lucas, the oldest, was already at that stage where he avoided his parents, locked himself in his room for hours and got irritated by any question he considered invasive. Gabriel, the youngest, was still a sweet boy and attached to his mother, seeking refuge in her embrace whenever he needed comfort. Daniel saw in his children the reflection of time that passed too quickly. One day they were kids running around the yard, the next they were too busy for casual conversation. It made him think about how his relationship with Laura had changed. They still loved each other, he didn't doubt that, but it was no longer the overwhelming love it had been before. It had become a peaceful, safe love, without surprises. Maybe too predictable. Laura, in turn, was a woman who never allowed herself to settle. She always liked challenges, new experiences, feeling alive. When she joined the company where she worked, she became one of the most respected professionals in the office. She had an impressive ability to solve problems, was articulate, determined and managed to gain the trust of everyone around her. Your boss, Leonardo, was an influential, charismatic and extremely demanding man. He always demanded the best from his team, and Laura, as someone who would not accept anything less than excellence, dedicated himself tirelessly to meeting expectations. This, however, meant overtime, travel, meetings outside of business hours. Daniel supported his career, but there were days when he wondered if that extreme dedication wasn't stealing something that once belonged only to him. There were times when they spent the night talking about anything, laughing at nonsense, planning the future. Now, the conversations were practical: who would pick up the children from school, what dinner would be, who would need to travel that week. Her touch no longer felt the same, the kisses were hurried, the looks were averted. Daniel noticed this, but he had always convinced himself that it was just a phase. All marriages went through this. It was normal, right? It was just tiredness, routine, the weight of adult life. He tried to reverse the situation in several ways. He planned family trips, bought unexpected gifts, prepared romantic dinners. But for some reason, I felt like Laura was never quite there. His smile was kind, his words were affectionate, but something in his gaze seemed distant, as if his mind was somewhere else. And the worst? He didn't know how to bring her back. The children, oblivious to what was happening between their parents, continued with their own concerns. Lucas was increasingly reserved, Gabriel still clung to the illusion that the family was unbreakable. But Daniel noticed that even the boys felt the change in the air, even if they couldn't name it. One night, after a long day at work, Daniel came home to find Laura finishing getting ready for a company event. The black dress highlighted her silhouette, the earrings sparkled in the soft light of the lamp. He watched her for a few seconds, feeling that mixture of admiration and uneasiness. She looked beautiful, as always. But when she turned to him, her expression no longer carried the familiarity it had before. It was almost as if she were a stranger. "Have you had lunch yet?" she asked casually, adjusting her lipstick in front of the mirror. "No, but it's okay. I'll eat something later." "I left food for you and the boys," she said, grabbing her purse and cell phone. "I don't know what time I'll be back, so don't wait up for me." He nodded, but felt a tightness in his chest. That sentence struck him strangely, as if it were more than just a warning. As if it were a veiled farewell. The next few minutes were filled with the sound of her heels echoing down the hallway, the door closing, the car engine moving away down the silent street. He stood there, standing in the living room, looking at the empty space she had left behind. The children were in their rooms, the house was plunged into an uncomfortable stillness. It was then that he realized something. It wasn't just the routine that was keeping them apart. It wasn't just her work, her tiredness, her responsibilities. It was something deeper, something that had settled between them silently, little by little eroding the connection they once had. But he didn't know what. Not yet. Dawn advanced slowly, and Laura did not return. He hadn't sent messages, he hadn't given any satisfaction. The clock said 3 in the morning when Daniel heard the sound of the car entering the garage. He didn't come to receive her. He just lay there, listening to her careful steps going up the stairs, as if she was trying not to make any noise. The bed dipped slightly as she lay down next to him. He smelled her, a different perfume than usual, something slightly woody, mixed with the unmistakable aroma of wine. He wanted to ask her where she had been, but he didn't. Maybe because I already knew that the answer wouldn't change anything. That night, something inside him broke. And from then on, there was no turning back. The days passed, and the feeling that something was wrong only grew inside Daniel. It wasn't paranoia. It was something subtle, almost imperceptible, but it manifested itself in small details that, when added together, formed a disturbing picture. Laura was further away. His responses were short, automatic, as if he were speaking without actually being there. Sometimes, when he tried to start a conversation, he noticed that she was looking at him without really seeing him, as if her mind was somewhere else. She spent more time away from home, due to work commitments, corporate dinners, last-minute meetings. The phone, which used to be left lying around the house, was now always in his hands or face down on the table. He tried to ignore it, tried to convince himself that he was just being insecure. But doubt began to seep in like poison. The nights when she arrived late became more frequent. Daniel began to notice patterns. She would go out dressed impeccably, with makeup in a different way than usual, and always return after midnight. At first, he didn't want to ask. He was afraid of the answer, afraid of appearing paranoid, afraid of the reality that was already beginning to emerge in his mind. But when he woke up alone for the 4th night in a row, hearing her car pull into the driveway in the middle of the night, something inside him broke. The next morning, he watched as she got ready for another work appointment. Her gestures were precise, the way she tied her hair, the way she put on her perfume. Everything meticulously calculated. This was not how she prepared for ordinary meetings. There was something different, something he couldn't ignore. When she picked up her bag and walked to the door, he finally asked, his voice firm but controlled. "Are you cheating on me?" She stopped midway, as if the question had hit her unexpectedly. She slowly turned to face him. Her gaze was unreadable, but there was something there, a hesitation, a flash of guilt before her expression hardened. "Don't be ridiculous, Daniel. I told you, these are work commitments. You've always trusted me, why are you questioning everything now?" He didn't respond right away. Because, at that moment, he realized that trust no longer existed. Not because he wanted to be suspicious, but because she had already destroyed the foundation on which they stood. Laura waited a few more seconds for a response, but when she saw that he wasn't going to say anything, she just let out an impatient sigh and left. The door closed, leaving behind a silence that weighed on his chest like lead. From that day on, he decided he could no longer live in doubt. If there was something going on, he would find out. Lonely nights became a torment. He began to observe more, noticing the excuses that were repeated, the schedules that didn't make sense, the subtle traces of a reality that he still didn't want to accept. Until, finally, confirmation came. It was on a Friday, when Laura left for another corporate event. He knew he couldn't stand another night lying awake, brooding over suspicions. So, he made a decision. He took the car keys and left a few minutes after her. He drove without an exact destination, just following his intuition, trying to find an answer that he might already know, but that he needed to see with his own eyes. After a while, he stopped on an inconspicuous street, not far from the center. And then, he saw it. Laura's car was parked in front of an upscale building. The lights in the third-floor apartment were on. He stood there, his heart hammering against his chest, as he tried to come up with some rational explanation. Maybe it was a real meeting, maybe I was just talking to a coworker. But his mind gave him no respite. The minutes passed, and he felt like he was drowning in thoughts, each one worse than the last. Until the door to the building opened. And there she was. Leaving alongside Leonardo. The boss. The two were too close. Laughing, exchanging looks that said more than any words could express. He saw her touch his arm, like she did when she wanted to feel protected. She saw him hold her waist, pulling her into a kiss that was reciprocated without hesitation. At that moment, everything collapsed. The truth hit Daniel like a sharp blade, cutting deep. He felt the air run out, his vision went dark for a few seconds. I wanted to look away, I wanted to believe it was just a nightmare from which I would soon wake up. But it wasn't. This was happening. There, in front of him, without a shadow of a doubt. What hurt wasn't just the fact that she was with another man. It was the way it was. There was passion in that touch, there was desire in that kiss. It wasn't something impulsive, a momentary mistake. It was something that had been around long enough to become intimate, to become familiar. And that was what hurt the most. He stood there, motionless, watching as the two re-entered the building, disappearing behind the door. Every part of his body was screaming for him to do something, anything. But what was there to be done? Go there and confront her? Create a scene? No. He needed more than that. He needed to be sure that she wouldn't find a way to escape, to distort the facts, to turn everything into a great illusion created by him. So he waited. Minutes. Hours. And when she finally left, alone, fixing her hair and checking that no one was around, she knew there was no turning back. Laura was no longer his wife. At least, not in the way he always believed it to be. But that still wasn't all. There was something bigger, something he didn't yet know. Something that would change everything irreversibly. And he was about to find out. The house was plunged into cold silence when Daniel opened the door and entered. The clock said just after 11 at night, and the smell of the food that Laura had prepared still hung in the air, but there was no one at the table. The children were locked in their rooms, and Laura, as usual, had not yet returned. He dropped his keys on the kitchen counter, took a deep breath, and walked slowly across the room, feeling the weight of what he was about to do. I knew I couldn't delay it any longer. Everything inside him begged for answers. He didn't just want confirmation of what he already knew, he wanted her to say it, he wanted to hear from her mouth the truth he tried so hard to hide. He wanted to see her reaction, he wanted her to drown in her own lie before he threw the whole truth on the table. When he heard her car pull into the driveway, his breathing deepened. He remained standing in the middle of the room, waiting, feeling the anger and disappointment boiling inside him like a volcano about to erupt. The key turned in the lock and the door slowly opened. Laura entered, fixing her hair, her heels clicking softly against the wooden floor. She closed the door without immediately noticing his presence, pulling her cell phone out of her bag and typing something quickly before finally looking up and seeing him there, standing still, motionless. The shock on his face was immediate. It was as if for a second, she didn't know how to react. But then, quickly, he composed himself, forcing a brief smile. Are you still awake? His voice came out too natural, as if nothing was out of the ordinary. We need to talk, he replied, without looking away. She sighed, taking off her earrings and walking to the kitchen, getting a glass of water. Can we talk tomorrow? I'm exhausted, I've had a long day. Daniel took a step forward, crossing his arms. Where were you? Laura hesitated for a moment, but then took a sip of water and replied indifferently. Team meeting. Took longer than expected. He laughed, but there was no humor in his laughter. It was an empty sound, full of irony. Meeting? His voice carried a tone that made Laura finally turn to face him. Yes, she reassured, now impatient. Daniel, what's happening to you? Why this obsession of wanting to know where I am all the time? He advanced slowly, his gaze piercing hers like razors. Because I saw it, Laura. Her breathing caught. She blinked a few times, as if trying to process the words. See what? You. Him. Leonardo's name burned on the tip of his tongue, but he didn't need to say it. Her look said it all. She was silent for a few seconds, and that brief interval was enough for the last spark of hope inside him to go out. Because there was no immediate denial. There was no outrage. Just that damn silence. Daniel, it's not what you think, she began, but her voice no longer had any strength. It is not. He leaned forward slightly. So tell me. What's it like? Explain it to me, Laura, because I really want to understand. I want to understand why the woman with whom I spent years of my life decided to go around sleeping with another man while I was here, at home, believing that everything was fine. She closed her eyes for a moment, running her hand through her hair, trying to find an answer that would minimize the situation, but she knew there was no more room for lies. I didn't want this to happen, she whispered. But it happened. He clenched his jaw. And it happened several times, didn't it? She lowered her head. I didn't need to say anything. The confession was there, stamped in the silence. He felt his chest contract, a suffocating tightness that seemed to crush his ribs. And then came the most painful part. I didn't want to hurt you, Daniel, she said, her voice breaking. I tried to stop. Tried? He repeated, the bitter taste of disappointment making his words sharp. Tried? The scream echoed through the house, and he heard a noise coming from upstairs. Gabriel. The youngest son had probably heard everything. And then, reality hit even more brutally. He wasn't just losing his wife. He was losing his family. Footsteps hurried down the stairs, and Gabriel appeared in the hallway, his eyes wide with confusion and fear. What is happening? Laura opened her mouth to respond, but Daniel was faster. Your mother was with another man, he said, each word coming out like a sharp blade. She was cheating on us. Gabriel froze, his eyes darting from one to the other, as if his mind refused to comprehend what was being said. That's not true, he murmured, voice cracking. Laura ran to him, trying to hold his hands. Son, it's not like that, I can explain. Explain what? Lucas's voice echoed down the hall. The eldest son was there, at the top of the stairs, his fists clenched, his face red with fury. Is he lying, Mom? Tell us he's lying. Laura opened her mouth, but no words came out. And in that instant, everything fell apart. Lucas took a deep breath, a visible tremor running through his body. I admired you, he said, his voice thick with disappointment. You were my mother. How could you do this to us? She stepped forward, her eyes shining with tears. Lucas, please. Don't call me that, he cut in, voice shaking. I don't want to hear anything. I don't want to look at you. The silence that followed was deafening. Gabriel swallowed hard, tears streaming down his face. You destroyed everything, he whispered. Laura collapsed right there, falling to her knees on the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. But it was too late. Lucas turned to Daniel. I'm going to get out of here. Daniel blinked, confused. What? I can't stay here. I can't live under the same roof as her. Lucas, please, Laura begged, but he was already heading back up the stairs, slamming the bedroom door shut. Gabriel remained where he was, looking smaller than ever. Daniel ran his hands over his face. The weight of that night was unbearable. He thought he would only lose his wife, but now he saw that he was about to lose his children too. And then, he understood. Betrayal hadn't just destroyed a marriage. He had destroyed an entire family. Daniel remained standing in the middle of the room, breathing deeply, trying to digest everything that had just happened. The words still reverberated in the air, heavy, filled with pain and disappointment. Laura was lying on the floor, her shoulders shaking with each silent sob, her knees drawn up to her chest as if she wanted to disappear right there. Gabriel was still there, but his gaze was lost, focused on a random spot on the wall, as if his mind was trying to disconnect from everything. Lucas, on the other hand, had disappeared into his room, slamming the door hard enough to make the structure of the house vibrate. It was as if the world Daniel knew was falling apart before his eyes, and he could do nothing to stop it. He ran his hands through his hair, trying to organize his thoughts, but all he felt was an overwhelming tiredness. He looked at Laura, that woman who was once the great love of his life, and realized that there was nothing left there. Not anger, not hate, just a deep emptiness. He didn't want to scream anymore, he didn't want to confront her anymore. There was no point. All that was left was to accept that nothing would ever be the same again. He looked away, back at Gabriel, who finally looked up at him, his face damp with tears. There was a question there, a silent desperation, a demand for answers that Daniel didn't know how to give. I need to get out of here, Gabriel murmured, his voice low, almost a whisper. I can't stand looking at her. Laura raised her head suddenly, her eyes swollen, her expression one of pure despair. Please, son, don't do that. We can talk, we can solve it. Gabriel took a step back, as if her mere proximity was too much to bear. Solve what? His voice broke at the end of the sentence, a lump forming in his throat. Do you think this has a solution? You destroyed our family. How am I going to look at you now and pretend nothing happened? I never wanted to hurt you, Laura insisted, extending her hands in an almost instinctive gesture, but Gabriel moved even further away. Daniel saw the exact moment her heart broke. But now it was too late. All that was left were pieces. Gabriel looked at his father, his eyes still shining with the tears that insisted on falling. "I'm going to the room. Just, don't call me. I don't want to talk to anyone right now." Daniel nodded slowly, and his son disappeared up the stairs. The silence that followed was suffocating. Laura was sobbing, but he couldn't feel sorry. "I couldn't feel anything. I just wanted to get out of there, breathe air that wasn't contaminated by the weight of that house." Then, without saying a single word, he walked to the door and grabbed his car keys. "Daniel." Her voice came hesitantly, low, almost fearful. He stopped for a moment, his hand on the latch, without turning to look at her. "Don't wait for me," was all he said before opening the door and leaving. The cold night air hit him hard as he got into the car and sped aimlessly. He didn't know where he was going, he just knew that he needed to get out of there, he needed distance, he needed to escape the suffocating pain that surrounded him. The streets blurred past the windows, streetlights illuminating his rigid expression, his jaw clenched as he tried to control the anger and frustration that still throbbed inside him. Everything he had built, everything he had protected, everything he had fought for over the years, destroyed in a matter of seconds. As if nothing had been worth it. As if he were a stranger within his own life. He didn't know how long he drove before he stopped in front of a small bar on the outskirts. It wasn't a place he usually frequented, but at that moment, it seemed like exactly what he needed. He went in and sat down in a dark corner, ordering a double whiskey. The alcohol burned his throat as he drank, but it couldn't drown out the pain he felt. He took out his cell phone, opened the gallery and scrolled through the years of photos he had accumulated. Images of family trips, of children's birthdays, of happy moments that now seemed to belong to another life. He stopped at a photo of Laura, taken a few years ago, laughing carelessly at some special dinner he could barely remember. That woman no longer existed. Or maybe it never existed. The phone screen lit up with a new message. It was from Lucas. "Dad, I don't want to stay here anymore. Can I go to your house?" Daniel felt a knot in his stomach. "Your home." As if their house was no longer a home. As if everything had already been divided before he could even process the reality of the impending divorce. He responded quickly, saying he would come get it. He finished the rest of the whiskey in one gulp and left the bar with a single fixed thought: he might have lost Laura, but he wouldn't lose his children. He drove back home feeling tiredness weighing on his shoulders like never before. When he parked in the garage, he saw Lucas waiting outside, a backpack thrown at his feet, his arms crossed over his chest. His face was closed, but his eyes carried the same hurt and confusion that Daniel felt. He got out of the car and walked towards his son, standing in front of him without knowing what to say. Lucas took a deep breath and lowered his head. I tried not to believe it, his voice was low, almost a whisper. But when I saw the way she didn't deny it, I knew. Daniel didn't say anything. He just placed his hand on his son's shoulder and squeezed lightly, a simple gesture, but one that said much more than any words could express. Lucas picked up his backpack and headed to the car without looking back. Daniel watched for a moment before doing the same. They left without saying anything to Laura, without looking at the house that now seemed just an empty place. The walk to the apartment was silent, only the noise of the road filling the space between them. When they arrived, Lucas dropped his backpack on the sofa and sat down, staring at an undefined spot on the wall. Daniel sat next to him, waiting for his son to speak, but the silence between them prolonged. I never thought this could happen to us, Lucas finally said, his voice filled with a sadness that seemed too great for his age. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of that statement. Neither do I. Lucas swallowed hard and looked away. And now? Daniel took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. Now, we move on. Any way you can. Silence once again filled the environment, but this time, it wasn't suffocating. It was just a bitter acceptance of what was now reality. Outside, the night continued its course. But for them, nothing would be the same again. That night was long. Lucas sat on the couch for a while, staring into space, his thoughts stuck on something that Daniel couldn't decipher. The silence between father and son seemed to carry an invisible weight, a wall of unspoken words that accumulated in the air, making it dense, suffocating. Daniel wanted to say something that would bring some kind of comfort, but what could be said? How did you fix something that was broken in a way that could never go back to the way it was before? He looked at his son, saw the tiredness on his face, the slumped shoulders, the reddened eyes, and realized that Lucas's pain was the same as his. But, unlike him, the boy hadn't yet learned to hide it. Time passed without either of them saying anything. Lucas finally got up, picked up his backpack and walked to one of the rooms in Daniel's apartment. He didn't ask for anything, he didn't ask anything, he just closed himself inside. Daniel remained in the room for a while, staring at the empty walls, trying to understand everything that had happened. There was a quiet eeriness to that space. The apartment had never seemed so small and at the same time so big. Small because the absence of the rest of the family weighed heavily, big because it now seemed like a cold, lifeless place. He got up slowly, walking to the kitchen, where he got a glass of water, feeling the dryness in his throat, a reflection of all the emotional exhaustion of the night. He took out his cell phone and saw several messages from Laura. First, desperate requests for him to return, then shorter messages, some incomprehensible, and finally absolute silence. He didn't respond. There was nothing to answer. He looked at his cell phone for a few more seconds before throwing it on the table and running his hands over his face. Fatigue was finally starting to take its toll. He went up to his room and threw himself on the bed, but he didn't sleep right away. Insomnia now felt like an old friend, a nagging reminder that his mind wouldn't let him rest anytime soon. He stood there, staring at the ceiling, hoping that, somehow, time would make it all hurt less. The next morning, when he left the room, he found Lucas already awake, sitting at the kitchen table, absent-mindedly playing on his cell phone. The boy looked up when he saw his father, but said nothing. Daniel pulled up a chair and sat across from him, trying to find some way to start a conversation. But the silence between them felt safer than any words that could be spoken. "Can I stay here for a while?" Lucas finally broke the silence, his voice low, hesitant, as if he feared the answer. Daniel nodded, without thinking twice. "Of course. As long as you need." The boy just nodded back, looking away from the cell phone screen. There was no thanks, but Daniel knew it wasn't necessary. Lucas was there because he could no longer stay in the house where everything had collapsed. And he understood this better than anyone. The day passed slowly. Gabriel didn't send any messages, and that worried him. He knew that his youngest son was sensitive, that he was probably still trying to process all of this. But his silence was a warning sign. He thought about calling, but hesitated. I didn't want to pressure him. He knew that Gabriel needed time, but at the same time, he feared that Laura's influence on him was stronger than he imagined. Late in the afternoon, while I was sitting on the couch reading some messages from work, the doorbell rang. His chest tightened, already predicting who it would be. He got up slowly and walked to the door. When he opened it, he found Laura on the other side. His eyes were swollen, his face was pale, as if he hadn't slept all night. She held the bag with both hands, squeezing the leather as if it was the only thing holding her steady. "We can talk." His voice was shaky, almost a whisper. Daniel didn't respond right away. He looked inside the apartment and saw Lucas sitting on the sofa, with headphones on, pretending not to notice his mother's presence. He looked back at her, pondering. There was a lot to be said, but I didn't know if I was ready to hear it. Finally, he sighed and stepped aside, allowing her to enter. Laura hesitated for a moment before entering and stopping in the middle of the room, as if the place was completely foreign to her. He looked at Lucas, waiting for some kind of reaction, but he didn't even look up. His chest rose and fell rapidly, as if his breath was caught in his throat. Gabriel is really bad, she began, her voice breaking. He doesn't want to talk to me, he's barely eaten today, he just stays in his room, not wanting to leave. Daniel crossed his arms, watching her. What did you expect? She bit her lower lip, looking down at the floor. He's just a kid, Daniel. He doesn't know how to deal with it. And who is to blame? His voice came out harsher than he intended. She closed her eyes for a moment before looking at him again. I made a mistake. I know that. I messed up. But I don't want to lose my children. You can feel all the hate in the world for me, but don't take it away from me. Daniel let out a dry laugh. I'm not pushing anyone away, Laura. You did this alone. She took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. I just want us to find a way to deal with this. For them. Daniel ran his hands over his face, feeling tiredness weighing down his shoulders. And how do you suggest we do that? Do you really think Lucas is just going to go home and pretend like nothing happened? That Gabriel will look at you the same way after all this? You broke their trust. Broke mine. And now you want to fix everything with a conversation? I don't know what to do, she admitted, tears streaming down her face again. I just know I can't lose my kids. Lucas finally took off his headphones and got up from the couch, walking to the door. I'm not going back home, he said, emotionless in his voice. And I don't want to hear you playing the victim either. The pain on Laura's face was evident. She looked at her son, but found no trace of the child she once held in her arms. Lucas no longer saw her in the same way, and that was more than she could bear. Daniel sighed, feeling the weight of the situation. None of that would have an easy solution. He knew his children needed structure, a foundation that would make them feel safe again. But how to do this when the family itself was falling apart? I won't stop you from seeing Gabriel, he said finally. But that will depend on him. If he wants to be with you, I won't be the one to stop him. But don't expect everything to go back to the way it was before. Laura nodded slowly, understanding that this was the best deal she could have. He took a deep breath, looked at Lucas once again, as if trying to find some spark of hope in him, but found only indifference. Without saying anything else, he turned and left. Daniel closed the door, feeling a deep emptiness settle inside him. He looked at Lucas, who remained standing in the same place for a few moments before letting out a heavy sigh and returning to the room. He ran his hands over his face and sank onto the couch. There was still a lot to be resolved. But one thing was certain, what had once been a family was now nothing more than scattered fragments. And he didn't know if they could ever be rebuilt. Time passed strangely over the next few days. Daniel felt trapped between two realities, one where he was trying to move forward and another where every detail of his life was a reminder of everything he had lost. Lucas remained in the apartment with him, but said little. He left for college, came back late, often locked himself in his room without eating dinner. Gabriel, on the other hand, was still with Laura, but his text responses were short, distant, as if the connection between father and son was slowly unraveling. Daniel wanted to believe that it was just a phase, that with time things would resolve themselves, but something inside him said that some marks were too deep to be erased. One Friday afternoon, after a long day of work, he parked his car at the building and spent a few minutes inside the vehicle, just staring at the dashboard. I had called Gabriel earlier, but the call was ignored. He tried again, and this time it went straight to voicemail. He sighed, feeling tiredness weighing down his shoulders. He took out his cell phone and opened the messaging app, typing something simple, "Son, can we see each other tomorrow? I want to talk to you." He sent the message and waited a few seconds, but nothing. No response, no confirmation. He put his phone in his pocket and got out of the car, feeling the cold night air touch his face as he went up to his apartment. When he entered, he found Lucas sitting on the sofa. The TV was on, but he didn't seem to be paying attention to what was on the screen. He had a charged expression, his eyes fixed on his cell phone, his fingers drumming on the side of his leg in an irregular rhythm. When he noticed his father's presence, he sighed heavily and threw his cell phone on the table. "Gabriel sent me a message," he said, his voice thick with exhaustion. Daniel frowned, feeling a sinking feeling in his stomach. "And what did he say?" Lucas ran a hand through his hair, seeming to hesitate before responding. "He wants to go home. But to our mothers." The words fell on Daniel like a cold blade. He felt the impact before he even fully processed them. He slowly sat down in the armchair, rubbing his hands over his face, trying to calm the whirlwind of emotions that threatened to overwhelm him completely. "Did he say that in so many words?" "Yes," Lucas confirmed, crossing his arms. "He thinks that it's his place. That there's still room to save something. And he wants me to go with him." Daniel blinked slowly, digesting the information. The thought of losing Gabriel was painful enough, but knowing that Lucas was being pressured to do the same was an even more cruel blow. He looked at his eldest son, trying to decipher his thoughts. "And what do you want to do?" Lucas was silent for a few seconds, then shook his head with a bitter laugh. "I don't know, Dad. I don't want to see our mother. Not after everything. But at the same time, Gabriel is my brother. I don't want him to be alone." Daniel closed his eyes for a moment. The idea that Laura still had control over Gabriel gnawed at him inside. He knew that the boy still saw her as a mother, a figure who, despite everything, was still an essential part of his life. And now, it seemed like he was about to lose his son for good. "Have you responded to him yet?" he asked, his voice coming out lower than he intended. Lucas shook his head. "I don't know what to say. I don't want to lie to him, but I also don't want him to think I'm giving up on him." Daniel nodded slowly. "You don't need to decide now. Just tell the truth. Say you need time." The son sighed and picked up his cell phone again, quickly typing a response. Daniel watched in silence, feeling helpless in the face of the situation. He wanted to protect his children, he wanted to stop Laura from continuing to destroy the family, but some battles simply couldn't be won. The next morning, Gabriel's message had still not arrived. Daniel looked at his cell phone every 10 minutes, waiting for some kind of response, but nothing. "I felt a tight knot in my chest, an anxiety that mixed with a deep feeling of loss." When the phone finally vibrated, he hurriedly picked up the device and saw his son's name on the screen. His heart pounded as he opened the message. "Dad, I need some time. I love you, but I can't be torn like this. I don't want to choose sides." Daniel closed his eyes, feeling the pain growing inside him. He quickly typed a reply, the words coming out almost automatically, "You'll never have to choose sides. I'll always be here for you." The answer never came. The day passed slowly, each hour dragging at a torturous pace. Lucas remained in the apartment, but avoided talking about Gabriel. Daniel knew he was also feeling the impact of the situation, but neither of them seemed willing to put their feelings into words. That night, as they ate dinner in silence, Lucas finally broke the ice. "Do you think he'll come back?" he asked, without looking up from his plate. Daniel took a few seconds to respond. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I hope so." Lucas nodded slowly, but didn't say anything else. That night, Daniel went out for a walk. "I needed air, I needed to think." The streets were quiet, the city lit by streetlights that cast long shadows on the asphalt. Every step seemed to take him a little further away from the pain, but at the same time, every corner, every storefront, every car that passed in the distance, everything reminded him of the family that was no longer the same. He took out his cell phone and, on impulse, opened the photo gallery. He passed through old images, through moments that seemed to belong to another life. The family together for dinners, trips, birthdays. All of that now seemed like a distant memory, an illusion he had held on to for too long without realizing it had been falling apart for a long time. He stopped in front of a closed cafe, staring at the reflection in the glass. His face looked more tired, more aged than he remembered. The life he knew had completely changed, and now he needed to find a new path. One that didn't include Laura, one that might not include Gabriel for a while. But he still had Lucas. And that needed to be enough. When he returned home, he found his son asleep on the sofa, his cell phone lying next to his hand. He took the device and placed it on the table, covering the boy with a blanket before sitting next to him. He stood there, watching his son's calm breathing, feeling a rare moment of peace. Despite everything, despite the pain and the losses, he still had something to protect. At that moment, he made a decision. I could no longer live waiting for things to resolve themselves. I needed to move on. He needed to rebuild his life. Laura's betrayal destroyed what he knew as family, but it didn't mean he could never find something new. Deep down, he knew that life had a strange way of putting everything into place. And maybe, just maybe, this was the start of something different. Something better. Time passed, and life continued its course, but nothing was the same again. The betrayal had not been just an act, an isolated mistake, a slip that could be forgotten as the days went by. No, it was an earthquake that shook the structures of everything that existed, that broke bonds that seemed unbreakable, that transformed people and feelings into shadows of what they once were. Daniel did not try to rebuild what had been destroyed, because he knew that some things cannot be repaired. Instead, he focused on moving forward, finding new meaning in his life without looking back. Gabriel never returned. The decision to remain with his mother was definitive, and over time, the distance between him and Daniel grew until the few conversations they had became rare, almost non-existent. The boy clung to the image he wanted to keep of Laura, as if he refused to see the consequences of what she had done, as if he preferred to believe that the family could be mended if he ignored the truth. Little by little, communication became a tenuous thread that hung in the air, sustained by sporadic messages and a void that Daniel didn't know how to fill. He tried. He called, sent a message, insisted. But he realized that he couldn't force Gabriel to see something he didn't want to see himself. The son chose his path, and all he could do was accept it. Lucas, on the other hand, took a different path. Time with his father made him mature, made him see the world with more critical eyes, made him understand that some wounds never heal completely. He never forgave Laura. I couldn't. For him, the mother he knew died the day he chose to destroy his family out of pure selfishness. When he finished college, he decided he needed a fresh start. He moved to another city, started his career away from the ghosts of the past and allowed himself to build his own story without carrying the weight of his mother's mistakes. He called his father frequently, visited whenever he could, but never, ever, looked for Laura. For him, she was no longer part of his life. And Laura? Her life took a completely different direction than you imagined. He believed he could continue with Leonardo, that the man for whom he risked everything would be the foundation for his new reality. But Leonardo never intended to build something with it. He discarded her as quickly as he won her, as if her betrayal wasn't something that mattered, as if she had just been a temporary distraction. She lost everything. Marriage, respect from children, stability that I thought would never end. You found out the hard way that certain choices come with a price too high to pay. When she realized she was alone, she tried to patch up the pieces of what she had destroyed, but it was too late. Gabriel was the only one who remained by her side, but even he, over time, began to realize that the woman he tried to defend was not the victim he believed her to be. Daniel, in turn, found peace where he least expected it. He didn't try to replace what he lost, but he allowed himself to start over. The pain of betrayal never completely disappeared, but it became a reminder, a lesson that made him see life more clearly. At some point, he met someone. It wasn't an overwhelming love, it wasn't an unbridled passion like it had been in the past. It was something different. Something built with patience, with maturity, with the certainty that true love does not need to be shouted from the rooftops, but rather felt in the silence of small things. He didn't seek revenge, he didn't wish Laura harm, he didn't try to fix what couldn't be fixed. Just moved on. And that was enough. Time, relentless as always, continued to pass. The memories were left behind, transformed into stories that were once part of their lives, but that no longer defined them. What was left of the family was a broken portrait, an echo of what could have been, a silent warning that betrayal doesn't just destroy marriages. It destroys trust, destroys bonds, destroys people. And now, the question remains, was it worth it? If you made it this far, comment what you thought of this story and what part impacted you the most. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any stories like this and activate the bell to receive all notifications. Remember, this channel does not support any type of betrayal. Until the next story.